Fiscal calamity, is that where we're headed? Republican Senator Gregg says yes, but is there anything we can do to stop it? Senator Gregg joins us. He is the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee. Good evening, Senator. And you use the term fiscal calamity, which is not particularly uplifting. So explain what you mean by fiscal calamity.
Well, that when you spend a lot more money than you're taking in, and when you're running up a deficit and a debt that is unaffordable and passing all that on to your children. We've got $13 trillion of debt right now we're passing on to our kids. That's going to double in 5 years, triple in 10 years. That's a fiscal calamity. That means basically our children are going to have to pay that off. And that means their style of life, their standard of living is going to go down because they're going to have to bear such a burden in order to pay off the debts which are running up on them today. And it's spending for today that's being passed on, the bills are being passed on to our kids tomorrow. And it's a calamity in my opinion.
I think it's safe to say that when all is said and done, don't blame Senator Gregg, because you've been saying this for quite some time. But I'm curious, has anything changed profoundly since the last time we spoke? Are there any new numbers out or anything else that makes you think it's even more of a train wreck? Or is there anything more appealing to think maybe we can pull it off and avoid that fiscal calamity?
Unfortunately, the numbers keep piling up at an extraordinary rate and an exorbitant rate, and nothing seems to be able to adjust those numbers. And in fact, what we've been doing in the Congress over the last 4 to 6 months has been to add significantly to the deficit and the debt situation. In fact, just last week or 2 weeks ago before we adjourned, we passed $29 billion of new debt, which will go right to the deficit next year, $22 billion of additional deficit spending next year in the first year of that bill. There's pending a bill that's going to add $42 billion of new debt in 2010. $43 billion of new debt in 2011. That's this bill that they claim is going to benefit small business. We're doing all this in the name of trying to get the economy going, but in the end, I think it's undermining the economy because people are looking at this and saying, well, how are you going to pay for it all? How are you going to pay for it all? And if you can't pay for it all, doesn't that mean that at some point we're going to have a fiscally difficult situation? Doesn't that mean the economy is going to be put into a straitjacket or put into a under severe stress? And yes, they're right. Common sense kicks in. The American people understand we're spending a lot more than we can afford, and that it's not going to work.
Well, I think, in order for me to keep track of this every night, I take notes. I take copious notes because it's so confusing what bills are pending, what bills are not pending, what's been spent, what hasn't been spent, what's proposed, what's not. And I think that's the thing. I mean, I imagine American people feel a little bit like I do, except they're probably not spending their time taking notes. And I'm curious, this jobs bill that the president, as he was leaving for vacation, he whacked the Republicans across the side of the head and said that you guys are obstructing it. But what is it about this jobs bill that you don't like, that you oppose?
Well, there were two bills that I think he's calling his jobs bill. One was just to pay off to teachers' unions and to big state governors, and that cost $29 billion, as I just said, which added immediately to the deficit $22 billion next year of new spending, deficit spending. The second one is the alleged small business bill. But that bill, again, in the short run, is going to add dramatically to the deficit and the debt. $43 billion or $42 billion in the first year and $43 billion in the second year. Those are numbers that compound, unfortunately, and they compound fairly quickly. And they go on top of the fact that we are running right now a $1.3 trillion deficit. Now, nobody knows what $1 trillion is, but it's a lot of money, and we got to pay it back, and our kids are going to have to pay it back. And next year, we're projecting another $1 trillion deficit. And the year after that, there'll be another $1 trillion deficit. And why is this? It's primarily because we're just spending too much. We've got to slow the spending down if we're going to get this government under control and get our deficits under control and not end up bankrupting our kids with all this debt.
So then I understand the Republicans' view on this jobs bill, because there is one report from the Labor Department that companies with less than 50 employees accounted for 61.8% of the job loss in the fourth quarter of 2009. So I'm looking at, what do we do for small businesses? Then I look over on the Republican side, and what I read, Senator McConnell releases something that says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing it, is that, that he's not opposed to helping small business, but we have to figure out how we're going to pay for it. So either we have to cut spending someplace else or do something. Is there any proposal on the Democratic side for this small business bill, the jobs bill the president's speaking about? Is there any suggestion how they'll pay for it other than more debt?
Well, yes, they claim that they're going to put in place adjustments which over 10 years will bring the bill back into balance. But the spending occurs in the front end and the alleged adjustments occur at the back end. And I think we know well enough that the Congress,
that doesn't happen.
When it has to start to pay for this, doesn't pay for it.
Right,
so that's the problem. You know, the problem small business has, I think, Greta, is very simple. They're just worried. You know, they've gotten this health care bill, which is going to cost them money. They see their taxes going up with the capital gains rates and the dividends rates and the top rates, which affect small business specifically. They've seen this financial reform bill, which is contracted credit, so it's hard on Main Street to get credit today. And then they see all this debt, and they're asking, how's that going to get paid for? Well, it's going to get paid for by small business probably having to foot a lot of the bill. So there's huge uncertainty out there, and people are just plain worried. And that's why they're not expanding. That's why they're not adding to the local business in downtown Manchester or in downtown Wichita.
I'll tell you what I think is more distressing. I think that small businesses are very resilient, and they can even take a hardship. But what they don't have is they don't have any certainty what Washington is going to do. And they'd have some certainty if Washington would either decide this or not decide this. But instead, I think it's rather appalling that everyone goes on vacation. It takes another month. A month is a long time to a small business. And President Obama said it's the first thing to come up with business when everyone returns September 13th or whatever it is. Well, that painful 3 weeks is horrible for small business. So while everyone has a great time on vacation, I don't begrudge vacations to anyone, is that what about the small business person? Do it now, take your vacation later.
Well, Greta, that is true to some degree, but I think the real problem here is that there is certainty. There's certainty of these new costs being put on the backs of small business, whether it's the health care costs, the lack of ability to get credit, or the tax burden. There's certainly of all these new regulations that are coming down the pike at them from this very liberal government, and so they're really concerned. It's how these different additional costs are going to be put on their backs that's creating their uncertainty. They don't know how they're going to bear this burden and still expand, so there's a reticence to expand. And this new small business bill isn't going to help a whole lot, in my opinion.
You're probably right, but I think on top of that, there's it's like putting poking a stick at a beehive. Is that the uncertainty only makes it worse? Because if the Congress is going to do something to them, tell them so that they can figure out what to do. Don't take a vacation now. I mean, don't
tell
just
them when
scare
we're going to shoot them.
People are already scared. People are already terrified about what's going to happen. But then they hear these huge numbers. They hear all these things that are going to happen, and then everybody goes on vacation.
Well, you know, I guess I'm of the school that says when the Congress is on vacation, you're actually a little safer than when we're in session, especially over this last 2 years. You know, I mean, the simple fact is that we've already passed all this legislation, which is going to increase the burden so significantly, especially on Main Street and on the small business person. So, you know, this small business bill, sure, if it's paid for, it's probably a good bill. If it's not paid for, it's not, because it's going to end up being financed by our kids, and that's not fair to our kids. But in the end, what is really going to expand the business community in this country and cause that individual on Main Street to be willing to go out and take a risk and create a job is the knowledge that they're going to be able to profit, that they're going to be able to gain from their investment and their effort and their work and the effort they're putting into creating these jobs. And right now they're very worried that they can't create a new job and not end up paying a lot of costs in the area of healthcare costs, in the area of lack of credit, in the area of new taxes. And so you've got a government right now that is basically saying, let's shift from the American entrepreneurial model, which is a model of American exceptionalism, to a model which is sort of like the European social demographic model, you know, where you have a social welfare state basically controlling the marketplace. And I think this American small business person understands that that's not going to work for them. And yet they're seeing Washington moving rather dramatically in that direction. And that's what's really worrying them. I think that's the true uncertainty.
Senator, thank you, sir. And